Happy Monday. I am looking forward to continuing into this study in abuse in the church. We're again looking at, in case you're not familiar with what we're doing here on the I Am Barabbas podcast and Mental Health and Scriptures live on Twitch, we are looking at this book written by Dr. Diane Langberg titled Redeeming Power, Understanding Authority and Abuse in the Church. You can see the cover there over my shoulder. And what we're going to be doing today is looking at chapter 2, which is about vulnerability and power. It's not a particularly long chapter. We'll see where the Spirit leads and what kind of what kind of stuff I end up talking about. Again, as always, please, if you find this helpful, share with friends, share with family, like, subscribe, follow, all that kind of stuff. It'll help us to reach more people and to hopefully create a more engaging community. The point of Twitch is to be able to stream live and to have people interact with whatever is being discussed. So a lot of people do video games on it. You can also have content like this. So if you are finding this helpful, would like to have more community feel, please go ahead and share with friends, family. I know it's 11 o'clock on a Monday weekday, so that makes it hard. But if we find that more people are listening and watching, and a different time will work better for everybody, then we'll definitely adjust and move forward from there. So what I want to do is first read from the Gospel of John, chapter 8. This is a passage that we understand now wasn't maybe part of the original writing in John, because there's like these early manuscripts of the Gospel of John that don't have this passage in it, and then eventually was added in by somebody. And so a lot of Bibles, most Bibles, will put brackets around the end of chapter 7 and after the end of the story, and a note to let you know that this story is not found in most early manuscripts. Now, it's kept in the Bible because it doesn't do anything to harm the story. It doesn't do anything to change anything about who Jesus is. And it seems that maybe somebody added it in because early in the church they were like, "Hey, this story happened. Where can we include this story in the gospel?" And they decided to put it there. So either way, it's a interesting story, and it helps for our purposes to highlight the understanding of how vulnerability and power work in relationships in society and in church in general. So start at verse 1. This is John chapter 8. But Yeshua went to the Mount of Olives. At dawn, he came again into the temple. All the people were coming to him, and he sat down and began to teach them. The Torah scholars and Pharisees bring in a woman who had been caught in adultery. After putting her in the middle, means in the middle of the room, the middle of this temple area, they said to Yeshua, "Teacher, this woman has been caught in the act of committing adultery. In the Torah, Moses commanded us to stone such women. So what do you say?" Now they were saying this to trap him, so that they would have grounds to accuse him. But Yeshua knelt down and started writing in the dirt with his finger. When they kept asking him, he stood up and said, "The sinless one among you, let him be the first to throw a stone at her." Then he knelt down again and continued writing on the ground. Now when they heard, they began to leave, one by one, the oldest ones first, until Yeshua was left alone with the woman in the middle. Straightening up, Yeshua said to her, "Woman, where are they? Did no one condemn you?" "No one, sir," she said. "Then neither do I condemn you," Yeshua said. "Go and sin no more." So, extremely interesting passage. One that, if you're familiar with church and you've been to church for a while, you've probably heard before and heard it taught in a lot of ways. We're going to apply it to these concepts here. They're related to mental health. They're related to psychology. They're related to the study of abuse, right? And so this is part of what I've been doing for a long time with my career in teaching and counseling, and being able to integrate biblical stories, passages, concepts with concepts related to mental health, uh, and and um, and those subjects pertaining. That's usually separated, isolated to that arena, right? So we're trying to find a way to bring them together. And for this subject, we're looking at abuse. We're looking at abuse in the church, and we're trying to break it down and understand it. We looked at chapter 1. We looked at power. We defined power, the sources of power, where power comes from, how power is used, and how power can be used to abuse and to abuse others. And as I said earlier, as you see there on the slide, today's lesson is about vulnerability and power. Okay, and vulnerability. So, what exactly does it mean to be vulnerable? Well, Dr. Langberg defines that for us in the very first page here, page 19. If you got the book, you're following along. Highly recommend that. It's She says to be vulnerable is to have the capacity to be wounded. Okay, just as power can harm or bless. And we talked about that on Friday's session. That power, we have power, and has a potential to in our with our power we have the potential to bless people. We have the potential to harm people. In the same way, vulnerability leaves humans open to being blessed and hurt. The vulnerability to experiencing good things and evil things, right? And ultimately, vulnerability is the just ability, the capacity, like she said, to be wounded, but really it's about us opening ourselves up to the potential of being hurt, while at the same time understanding there's a potential for something good to happen. So, for example, an example that she gives later on in the book, uh, people that decide to get married, or people that choose to have children. When you make that decision, if you're a parent, if you're married, you're in a long-term relationship. Let's say you're not married, but you're in a relationship with somebody. You are essentially choosing to potentially be hurt by someone, right? When I decided to get married, I said I'm going to marry my wife. I proposed to her. We got engaged. I was opening myself up to the possibility that one day she's going to hurt me, and that hurt can be like infidelity. It could be just not wanting to be with me, just her feelings changing and not wanting to be in a relationship anymore. And that's the kind of vulnerability you get into when you decide to commit to a long-term relationship, right? You just don't always know what someone else is going to want, what someone else is going to want to do in the long term, right? You're vulnerable. So it's been 9 years now, and we're gonna have our 10th year anniversary in December. And it feels like it's safe. It feels like I opened myself up to that vulnerability where a relationship could end. It could be devastating, all that kind of stuff. And it feels like in that vulnerability, instead of you know experiencing the pain, we've experienced the good stuff and the happy stuff and the blessings. And then after a year of marriage, we decided we'll try to have a child. And so we started trying, and then we had our daughter. And if you have a child, like, there's so many things that could go wrong making the decision. When we sat down, we're like, okay, we're going to try to have a kid. What are we going to do? Because we were you know counseled to wait a year and get to know each other, and then from there kind of decide what you're going to do. And so we are at that point where you have to weigh these options. It's like a big part of that is, man, if we have a child, are we prepared for that child to be sick? Are we prepared for that child to be disabled? A lot of parents go into it thinking, "Oh, we're gonna have a child. Everything's gonna be good," but you just never know what's going to happen. You never know if your child's going to be born autistic or some other disability and isn't able to walk, and you're going to have to spend the rest of your life caring for this person that you decided to bring into the world, right? And so that's that vulnerability we have. And really think about it, we're vulnerable in a lot of different ways. Every time we get in a car and we leave our families, and we go off to the grocery store, there's a vulnerability we have, because ultimately vulnerability is a reflection of the fact that we can be hurt and we can be killed. We can die in this world, right? And we can be killed physically, like literally. We can be killed emotionally. We can go through things that really hurt us and harm us for a long term, for a long point in time. And that vulnerability is what can lead to the kinds of abuse that we can see in the church. Okay, that vulnerability, because it exists. Now, when whether or not we understand vulnerability exists, it doesn't really affect how we use vulnerability with each other and how it's used in relationships, right? Whether or not we acknowledge it, I should say, because not always. I mean, I sometimes I read stuff like this and I'm like, oh yeah, that's true. I mean, it's there. It's not something I'm always thinking about, but vulnerability is always there, and so we have choices always, whether or not we acknowledge that it exists, as to how we're going to handle the vulnerability of others and ourselves. Okay, so the first note I wanted to make out of the chapter was that we have three positive choices when it comes to vulnerability. We can, number one, protect, we can nurture, and we can love. Right. So she gives the analogy again of a newborn baby, the vulnerability of a newborn baby. She talked about in chapter one, a newborn baby has a lot of power, right? A newborn baby will take sleep away from parents, will require a lot of attention, a lot of care. They cry, and you've got to go and you've got to sacrifice your own needs, your own desires, your own wants to go and care for this newborn baby. There's a lot of power there. The thing is, though, the baby's also extremely vulnerable. And so while they can use its power to communicate its needs and to demand that its needs be taken care of, the parent understands the vulnerability of the child, the fact that the child cannot feed itself, the child can't take care of itself, the child can't, change itself. There's, obviously the child is extremely vulnerable. And so the parent has a choice to make. Am I going to protect this child? Am I going to hear the child cry and go and see that the child is cold and she needs a blanket? Am I going to nurture this child? Like the child is crying and is expressing in a power that I need, in the power that they have. Like, I need to cry, I need to feed, I need to feed. It's 3 o'clock in the morning. The parent understands the vulnerability of the child. The parent understands, well, the child can't get up out of bed right now and go feed himself, so I've got to go feed him. But you got to make a choice. You're going to protect the child. You're going to nurture. You're going to go ahead and feed the child, hold the child, and are you going to love the child? Right? We have these choices every day when it comes to vulnerability and the vulnerability of others. And when it comes to the negative side, we can choose to not care about the vulnerability of others and to also exploit people and exploit their vulnerability. Okay, so that's the negative side. So you can hear a child crying. That's a lot of power. Wakes me up. It's middle of the night, but at the end of the day, I could say, you know what? I'm not going to respond to their power. I'm going to ignore it. Instead, I'm going to respond to the fact that they're extremely vulnerable and decide I'm not going to help them at all. And eventually, their power will be taken away. And I mentioned I've recorded Friday's message session so many times I don't remember which anecdotes I ended up sharing, but there was this story I remember. So if this was on Friday, excuse me if you're hearing it again, but it was about my cousin who had gone to China and had visited an orphanage, and she saw a 2-year-old child in a bed that just was non-responsive, and it was indication of a child who had learned over time, like, when I cried, no one's going to come for me. And so that child was extremely, like, the power had been completely taken away. The child had no voice, didn't know how to react, didn't know how to interact or whatever. Vulnerability exploited and exposed. Right, really sad analogy, but that's what could happen. You could take away the power when you understand how vulnerability works. Okay, you can choose to either protect it and nurture someone and love them, or you can choose to exploit them for it and eventually take away their voice and take away their power so that you can have more power for yourself. Okay, so that's how that works. So vulnerabilities, we're going to continue on here with this concept. So what's interesting also is she talked about how when it comes to vulnerability, one of the reasons why we may not understand it or recognize it, I should say, or acknowledge its effects on our existence is due to generational patterns of the exploitation of the vulnerability of others. Okay, so for example, she uses this newborn analogy, and she says, imagine that a newborn is born to a 16-year-old girl who is living in kind of this situation where a house where men are always coming in and out, related to her own mother's activities. And in fact, the reason why she got pregnant and had this child is because one of these men saw the vulnerability of this young woman. She was 15, took advantage of her, and then she had the baby, right? And the question is, does that 16-year-old girl who was taken advantage that way, who's been exploited her whole life, and was extremely vulnerable and was not cared for, is she going to know how to care for and protect and nurture and love the child that she now has? It's most likely that because of the pattern of exploitation that she experienced with her own vulnerability, she's going to continue on in that pattern. And so, what Dr. Langberg mentions is that the patterns of how we treat people and the patterns and how we respond to vulnerability is usually established through generations and through practice. One of the things that we, when we both my wife and I came from homes that weren't exactly the safest places to come from. I mean, personally, like my father, and I've mentioned this before, was an alcoholic. He was a predator, and a lot of stuff that he didn't really know about until later on in life. But then there were others who did know, and so there was a lot of lies that were being told. There was a lot of abuse that was happening, a lot of emotional abuse and psychological abuse and emotional abuse. Occasionally, there was some hitting, but when I think back on it, I'm like, it was more in line with, for me personally anyway, it was more in line with, like, discipline. You got, immigrant parents, they're going to hit. My dad only hit me 3 times. I remember specifically 3 times he slapped me, so that's not great to be slapped, but they were always related to something I had done wrong. But um, it was just an abusive home, okay? And my wife didn't have the greatest home either. She didn't have a lot of the safeguards around her that she should have had as a young lady. And so we had to work on, we're going to have a child, we're going to have a family, we're getting married. We had to work on how we wanted to be different from what we grew up in. And when I look back on it, like my dad's behavior and his pattern of acting reflected what he himself kind of experienced when he was younger. And my grandfather was eventually a Christian. His life was different, changed, but there was some stuff that was going on there, some separation, some putting children in boarding schools because they couldn't take care of them all, and just there was some instability there. As great as the faith was, there's like parenting. There was a lack in some of the best practices, I would say, and I think my dad was a reflection of that, and then plus, with all the other stuff he was into. So, like I said, and what Dr. Langberg was talking about here, and what you have to consider too, is what is my history and pattern with vulnerability. Um, and so, first we consider, like, what is your history of understanding the vulnerability of others? She gives an anecdote here about a man who his own fear of vulnerability led to him desiring to gather as much power as he could so that he could exploit the vulnerability of others. Uh, and what that looked like was he would he would humiliate, condemn, and control women. He he would do that to his employees, to his wife, his daughter. He had also had a secret life visiting sex workers, who he treats with loathing and rage. He doesn't understand why he can't stop these behaviors. And she talked about the vulnerability that he had when he was a child, the kind of home he grew up in, and how, because he felt that vulnerability and that fear that he was going to be exposed, he went ahead and grabbed as much power as he could so that he could try to exploit the vulnerability of others so they can protect his own, right? And that's a pattern there. Uh, I've been exploited, I've been hurt, so I'm going to exploit others and I'm going to hurt them so I can protect me. And Dr. Lamberg says here in on page 21, she says, "You will never, by intelligence, accomplishment, seat of power, respect, or any other thing, be able to make yourself invulnerable." And so, if your pattern of vulnerability, your own personal pattern of vulnerability, surrounds itself or revolves around exploitation, meaning you're fearful of being vulnerable, right? Like I said, I when I got married, that when you get yourself into relationships, you're exposing yourself to vulnerability. The more relationships you have, the more vulnerable you are. I'm talking about romantic relationships, friendships. You know, if people come over to your house, we had some friends over on Saturday, and you know we had dinner, and you're sitting there and you're having conversation, and you never know, right? Like you just okay. Two of the people is people I know well, known for a while. The other two kind of just getting to know kind of thing, and you never know like how's this going to turn out. Are they going to like me? Are they going to accept me? Are they going to be accepting of me? Or am I going to say something that's going to make somebody angry? The vulnerability is there. And what do? Do I try to find a way to control how they respond to me? Am I going to try and understand that they also feel vulnerable, right? They're coming to our house. They've never been there before. We kind of ask people to take their shoes off, and if we didn't ahead of the time like inform people, hey, ask your shoes off. Then you come. Let's say you've got like jacked up feet, and uh, you don't want to take your shoes off because you don't want people to see your toes and the way that your calluses are, your toenails are all bent or whatever. And that's a real vulnerability, right? And so what do I do? Like if I want to protect my own vulnerability and express my power and say like I hate it when my house gets dirty. People bring in their feet into the house and stuff. So yeah, take your shoes off. I don't care about your feet. Or do I have an extra pair of socks I can give them? Say, oh, hey, if you don't mind, I can get you a pair of socks. Or can I be lax and say, you know what? I understand your vulnerability here. You don't want to take off your shoes. Just go ahead and come on in, uh, and don't worry about it. And then in my mind, I'm thinking we'll go ahead and mop after they leave and make sure the house is clean just in case, right? And those pattern. And so the more relationships you get into, there's all this stuff you have to think about. There's more and more vulnerabilities that you expose yourself to. And some people do try to isolate themselves and draw themselves in and try to cover and protect so that they don't get exposed to vulnerability, and they limit the amount of relationships they have. That's a fear. But ultimately, like as I read here in the quote, you can't make yourself invulnerable. We're always going to be vulnerable to someone at some point, and others are going to be vulnerable to us. Okay? And what comes down to what we have to consider is how are we going to respond to the vulnerability of others. Now, I read this passage earlier as we started, John chapter 8. I see some of you came on as um, had already read it, but if you want to look at it, you can look at it. It's John chapter 8, verse starting at verse 1. We look at it here. It's a story rife with vulnerability and the exploitation of that vulnerability. Okay? The exploitation of the vulnerability. So these guys it just mentions Pharisees and Torah scholars, and we did this whole study in John, the I am statements, and the seven miracles. And so, if you're familiar with that material, you're familiar with the idea of John's audience and the Gospel of John, what John was trying to do was trying to help his reader, who he considered to be a Samaritan Jew, a Galilean Jew, to see uh, the enemy of the faith is not being all Judeans, but the Judean leaders, right? And also for the Judean readership, for them to see that the problem wasn't, and it aren't the Samaritan Jews and the Galilean Jews. The problem was their own leadership rejecting the uh, the fact that Jesus is the Messiah. And it's so that group of people, that group of people, the Judean leaders, who are described as, he says here, the Torah scholars and Pharisees, they bring into where Jesus is at in the temple a woman who'd been caught in adultery. Now, I remember a long time ago, when I was getting my degree, uh, a female student, an older lady, she was like, "Man, my mind goes to what this woman would have been like. Was she dragged there naked? Was she still like physically like just dirty from having sex? Like from contact, did they give her time to wash up and come out? And probably not, right? And so if you think about that, just how vulnerable someone is after having sex, being dragged out from wherever they were and brought there, right? The ultimate, again, example of what it means to be vulnerable. And what was the leadership trying to do? They were trying to exploit this situation for their own purposes, right? Their own purposes. They want Jesus to affirm their authority, right? This is their goal. Their whole goal, their whole time in any of the gospels, especially in the Gospel of John, is they want Jesus to align himself with their authority. They want it's kind of it's like it's this. It's they would have never bothered Jesus if Jesus had just said, yeah, the Pharisees, the scribes, look how great of an example they have set, and we should obey them, we should follow them. And as a rabbi, am I only going to teach according to how they see things, and I'm going to fall in line with their plans. If he had done that, his ministry could have gone on for the next 30, 40 years, however old he would have been when he died of natural causes. But he wasn't here for that, right? And at every turn, when he had a chance to support and fall in line with their ideologies, he would speak the things of God which contradicted them, which should point out to them they've got a problem, that their teachings contradict to them. And so here they're trying again to use someone they know he's going to care about, and so they're trying to hit on his vulnerability, and they're using her vulnerability, and they're trying to exploit the vulnerability of Jesus, and the where it's like, he's a rabbi. Are you going to follow what the teaching says? Right? That's where Jesus is vulnerable, because if it's straight up in the law, like this is what you have to do. If a woman's caught in adultery, you have to stone her. Then how can Jesus say otherwise, right? So he's vulnerable. He's a rabbi. He's kind of maybe caught in a pickle, and the woman is extremely vulnerable, and her sin is being exploited. And Jesus actually doesn't respond, right? And what was probably the most interesting thing about this chapter was how Dr. Langberg points out that our response to the vulnerability of others shows us what's inside of us. In fact, there's a quote here I have. She says, anytime we confront vulnerability in a newborn, a confused teen, a person hungry for love and attention, looking in all the wrong places, or a sick or weak or impaired person, what comes out of us tells us about us. Okay. She gives this really great anecdote where she was teaching in a seminary, and she told this story uh, to the seminary students. As pastors, you will always have power in your relationships with congregants, always. And it's just a reality in your church. Whatever church you go to, your leadership has power. If you are a leader in a church, you have power, and you can never underestimate the amount of power you have. And she continues, whether you feel powerful or vulnerable at any given time, you're the one with power in that relationship. Your words and actions carry authority. If a woman comes to see you for counseling about her marriage, and one day, confused and longing for attention, she stands up and undresses in front of you, what happens next depends entirely on you, with emphasis added. What she has done tells us some things about her for sure, but what you do in response tells us about you. It tells us what you are like in the presence of unfettered vulnerability. And she concludes, the classroom was very quiet. And it's something that people don't want to recognize these days. I think I've seen it more commonly than in the past, where people don't want to recognize their own response to the situation in which someone's unfettered vulnerability is presented in front of them is what matters, not the unfettered vulnerability, not the woman taking off her clothes and like she's extremely vulnerable, and yeah, there's some stuff going on there, like Dr. Langberg says. But for me as a leader, as a person, to have someone do that in front of me and then to respond by saying, "Oh, here we go. Let's do this. Let's have sex together." Yeah. And then to say, "Well, I mean, she's the one who took off her clothes, like she did in front of me." It's like, "Well, what about you?" Right? What about you? Jesus taught about this, and the concept that this comes out of this teaching that Dr. Langberg gets is from Scripture. It's from Mark chapter 7. Mark chapter 7, verse 20. It reads, and he continued. This is Jesus speaking, and the context is, they were asking him, why don't you do the cleaning rituals like we do, washing dishes and stuff like that. And so Jesus is responding, and he's like, these people, they wash the outside of the cup, but they don't clean the inside. And ultimately, he makes this point. He says, it is what comes out of the man that makes him unholy. For from within, not without, from within, out of the heart of men, come evil intentions, sexual immorality, theft, murder, adultery, greed, wickedness, deceit, lustfulness, envy, slander, pride, and foolishness. All these evil things come from within and make him unholy. And notice that lustfulness is included in that passage there. And lusting has always been something that's been about other people or outside of me. In fact, there's an entire series of teachings at Every Man's Battle, which I know is, some men are talking about how it helps, but I read through it, and from what I remember, what I understand is that the focus is on what you're looking at and bouncing your eyes and so on and so forth. And so a lot of it is like behaviorism, where you're learning and practicing how not to look at people, and in that moment have that lustful thought. So like, oh, there's a woman, she's pretty, look at she's wearing, and thoughts start like this chain of events start happening, where your mind starts thinking certain things about the woman. So the first step is to, once you look, bounce the eyes away, and then hopefully the chain of thoughts, we can create a habit where the chain of thought doesn't continue on into this is Guthrie's mode of breaking habits and so on and so forth. This stimuli and method in trying to break the chain of reaction. And it's, it can help people, I guess, but ultimately, as Jesus said, like the source of this stuff comes from inside of you. Like if you're looking at a woman, she's in a bikini, and you're at the beach and you're having lustful thoughts, the problem isn't with her wearing a bikini. The problem is what's going on inside of you, what's coming out of your heart. I mean, the scripture is clear here. The scripture is clear here, and I'm speaking to myself. I mean, I'm not perfect. I understand what I'm saying and the implications of it, but I cannot blame what others are doing for what comes out of me. That's what Jesus is saying. It's like, this is what's coming out of you. You struggle with greed. It's because greediness is in your heart, and your heart is blossoming and showing this is the fruit. Wickedness and deceit, lying. If you're lying a lot, like that comes out of you. And Dr. Langberg is saying is, when you have vulnerable people in front of you, and they're extremely vulnerable, it's unfettered, as she says, there's no ties to it. What is your response to their vulnerability? Is it to exploit them? As we saw in our passage with Jesus in John chapter 8, he just mysteriously kept writing down something in his finger. And remember, he himself is vulnerable too. If he teaches outside of the scriptures, then it's very possible that, it can kind of ruin his whole ministry, his whole testimony, everything else. He's writing down on the ground. Now, a lot of people are conjecture, like, what is Jesus writing? We don't know. We don't know. One thing you should know is in Deuteronomy chapter 24, when he talks about adultery, the law there isn't about the woman. The law there is about anyone. So the one thing that is very obvious here is that they did not bring the man who was committing this adultery with this woman to the scene as well, right? That's probably a purposeful thing. We don't even know. It could have been a trap. It could have been a thing where one of them themselves are like, hey, go pay that lady over there to do some stuff with you. Once you start, like, we'll come in, we'll grab her, and then you just get out of there, right? I don't know, but it's very clear that's part of it. Now, The strongest guess I've heard about what Jesus was writing in the dirt was the law. And what it's pointing out is, hey, one of you, and he would have known which one, right? Because he's God and everything else, but one of you was with her. And so when he says, the sinless one among you, let him be the first to throw stone at her. He could have been writing a bunch of different things. He could have just done that one thing. Maybe he was writing some laws. Whatever it was enough for them to realize maybe we're supposed to be stoned too, or like we should be. So he went back on them with their vulnerability, right, to protect her. And it's like we looked at that before. Like what are your choices with vulnerability? It's to protect, it's to nurture, and to love. He sees this woman's vulnerability, and what comes out of his heart, what comes out of his being is the desire to protect her and to love her and to give her one of the most nurturing statements he could give her. He says to her, neither do I condemn you. Go and sin no more. And he recognizes that she is guilty. She has sinned and under the law like she's supposed to, but he shows her a kind of grace and mercy that shows us how we should be considering our responses to those who are vulnerable in our presence. And here's where we get straight to application and wrap things up with this morning's session. The intention of this study is for us to look at together how abuse happens in the church, and for those of you who have been abused, to come to realization about how things happened, how you got into the situation you got into, and how your leadership was responsible for what they did, and where maybe you were responsible for some decisions that you made, and how we can better understand abuse in the church and move forward from there, right? And another thing I want to do with this study is to make sure that those of you who are in leadership, who have power, that you understand how abuse happens and how you are guilty of it, if you are, or how you can prevent yourself from becoming guilty of it. In my experience as a professor for now 10 years, I have come across so many my students who have been abused spiritually in different churches throughout South Florida. Heard story after story after story, and it's made me so cynical of these churches. Some churches I don't even want to go visit. I don't even want to go and attend or see, because I've heard and experienced through the vulnerability of others, their testimony, witness, the amount of abuse that they've gone through. And I'm like, why would I go there? And yet, while I was learning and seeing firsthand how churches have been abusing people who are precious to our Father and precious to me as they're under my care and they're in my classroom, I myself was experiencing abuse and didn't know it. 3 years after my graduation, and I've been teaching now for 4 years, is when I finally started to realize what was going on. And then I went to another church and I ended up in another abusive situation. And since then, I wrote a note in this book. Started reading this book in 2021, so I wrote a note in here how I haven't let myself become vulnerable again to any church since 2016, the year my daughter was born. And I don't like living that way. I don't like living that way. We started going to church I grew up in. I was raised in the church I first, experienced some stuff in and left originally, and we decided to go back there because some things had changed at leadership as we were told, and we're like, okay, we're going to go. And it's a it's a huge step in vulnerability, like opening myself up, opening ourselves up. And I told the leadership, like, so much in this word, like, we're here to see, like, can we be vulnerable here again? Can we be vulnerable here again? And for those of you who've been abused by church, it is so hard. I know you've been abused by the church. and church leadership, and it's hard to do anything church related. You want to have your relationship with God. You want to have a relationship with other believers as well. But when it comes to church and church stuff, it's you don't want to touch it. And I'm right there with you. Like it took a couple years, and the pandemic was a great excuse here online, and we found a good community online. We enjoyed it. They just they're not local, and we don't want to keep doing online services anymore. So even though that's the safest way to be, to protect yourself, I just want to encourage you to pray and to speak. And if talking to me is something that can help, like, let's do it. I don't charge anything for anything I do. I just want to help people. And so if we want to talk about it and work on some of the stuff, and some of you have told me before how hard it is to open up a Bible, because when you open up the Bible, it just floods back all these memories, and and the trauma, and that's part of PTSD. And so I've encouraged people in the past, I encourage you now, like, if the Bible, opening up the Bible or going to church is difficult, it brings up all these negative feelings, and these feelings of that are associated with the emotions you had when the abuse occurred, and these feelings of memories and all the abuse you had gone through. Then it's okay. The Bible, you can put it aside. You can uh, find other ways to connect with our God. And it could be through someone, like talking with someone like me. It can be through worship, singing songs and praise. And sometimes that's a trigger too, because the worship song, maybe the worship leader was someone who took advantage of you, which happens a lot in churches. Uh, but my encouragement is, like, don't give up. If anything, if the only thing you can do without feeling, the trauma, and remembering all this stuff that you've been through, just pray. You yourself, God, pray. Start there. Start there, and then talking to a counselor. If it's me, if it's someone else, that's fine. You talk to a counselor, work through the trauma, and eventually you can get back to a place when you open up the scriptures, you study it, and you enjoy it, and there's delight, because the Spirit of God is able to teach you something from the things that have been written so many years ago. He's able to make these things come alive. It's what he does. He makes things, the scripture comes alive. But it's not your fault if it doesn't right now. It's not your fault. You were exploited in your vulnerability, and that's not your fault. Okay, so I am done there. Hope this was encouraging. Hope this all makes sense. Remember that you have your own vulnerability, and others have theirs as well. And every day, every moment, every relationship, we have the choice to either exploit others in their vulnerability, or to protect them, nurture them, and to love them in their vulnerability. And those choices reflect the state of our heart and what's going on inside of us. And if we have difficulty loving and protecting and nurturing others, you need to take a good look at yourself. Try to figure out what it is about you and your pattern of vulnerability, and why it is you go towards exploiting the vulnerability of others rather than protecting them and nurturing them and caring them. Especially if you're a church leader, you really, really need to work on that. More than that, you probably need to step down and get that right before you move forward. God's grace is there for everyone, but it matters what we do in the moment. And if what we do in the moment harms others, then we need to take a step back and stop acting, so that we stop harming. Thank you. Thank you for watching. God bless. I'll see you tomorrow. Remember, we'll stream tonight, this evening, I should say, the afternoon, around 4:30, 5 o'clock. We'll do some gaming, and with Hadassah, and try to do some uh, more friendly, not friendly, lighter talk with my daughter there. So if you're interested in that, please set an alarm, watch a streaming, and also this will be available on YouTube later. If you're watching this on YouTube, please like and subscribe and share with others. Get the word out. Again, my goal is just for people to be brought to His feet, and to have a better and closer relationship with Him. And so there's nothing that I want out of it other than to be a blessing to others. And so the more we share, if you find it beneficial, please share, like, subscribe, follow, all that good stuff. All right. Have a good day.